I'm excited to tell you about the woman that I'm going to introduce. A few years ago, I worked for the Irish Times out of Dublin and had covered some conflicts and wars in the former Yugoslavia. And got a call from one of my editors one day saying, we'd like you to review a book called The Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. Can you review this book in about 2 weeks? I said, sure, fine. They sent me this book. It's 600 pages on genocide. Now, you know, your reaction to this is, oy. I start to read this book, and it was one of the most compelling, fierce books I had ever read in my life. A lot of people agreed, of course, it won the Pulitzer Prize. It won every prize imaginable. Samantha Power had been a reporter covering conflict in the Balkans in 1995, and she decided to write this book where she decided to survey the major genocides of the 20th century. The Bosnian Serbs' eradication of non-Serbs, the Ottoman slaughter of the Armenians, the Nazi Holocaust, Pol Pot's terror in Cambodia, Saddam Hussein's destruction of Kurds in northern Iraq, and the Rwandan Hutu systematic extermination of the Tutsi minority. And what she wanted to find out is why these things happen and how were they permitted to happen. What she found out was quite interesting in her conclusions about particularly why a superpower such as America did not stop these genocides. Part of it was indifference. In her book, she wrote, "No U.S. president has ever suffered politically for his indifference to its occurrence. It is no coincidence that genocide rages on." She also found out that it really just wasn't about getting the word out, that even with news coverage, these things don't stop. She wrote that back in 1915, when communications were primitive, the New York Times managed to publish 145 stories about the Turkish massacre of Armenians. Nearly 80 years later, the same paper reported just 4 days after the beginning of the Rwandan genocide that tens of thousands of Rwandans had already been murdered. It devoted more column inches to the horrors of Bosnia between 1992 and 1995 than it did to any other foreign story. In other words, knowing is not enough. Action and advocacy are called for. I loved the last paragraph of Samantha's book, where she quotes George Bernard Shaw. And she says that Shaw once wrote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." After a century of doing so little to prevent, suppress, and publish genocide, Americans must join and thereby legitimate the ranks of the unreasonable. Well, who better to be an advocate and to accomplish the best of journalism than an unreasonable, Irish-born, Harvard-educated, outraged, and determined woman? In the last 2 years, Samantha Power has made the crisis in Sudan her personal cause. 50,000 people have died in the Sudan and 1.5 million have been ethnically cleansed. As both a scholar and an academic and as a reporter, she traveled back to the Sudan and did the on-the-ground reporting to bring this news to the world. I must tell you, one of the things that she's written about, I mean, this kind of reporting is, you can't overstate how difficult it is. One of the ways that you find out, sometimes one of the first ways you find out that there's been a massacre somewhere is people in a village say they're getting sick from the water. Well, Samantha found out, of course, as in many places in the world, that corpses had been stuffed down the wells. So not only is there a massacre, but the water supply is poisoned and more people die. She did that kind of reporting. She got the word out from the New Yorker to the New York Times to the LA Times to NPR. I think she probably would have written for the National Enquirer if she'd been asked. She's been determined to get the story of Darfur out. In April, she gave compelling testimony to Congress, but it was also prescriptive. She said the U.S. and other Western powers should threaten to impose multilateral targeted sanctions, travel bans, and asset freezes against members of Sudan's regime who are most directly responsible for the human rights violations in Darfur. Samantha Power marries the best of journalistic inquiry, which is so different than the adventurism we see in so much reporting today. She has a passion for truth-telling and advocacy, and she demands that we not avert our eyes, that we not choose the comfortable twilight of not knowing. It's my pleasure to introduce Samantha Power.
I'm sure all of you have had a moment where you sort of look around and you say, how the hell did I start keeping this company? And the women who were recipients of the award before me bring that thought and that incredulity to mind. I'm so honored to be up here